we're not designing an environment in its entirety. We're doing kind of the inverse of what we did in our first assignment, where you guys made a world map which was indicative of your game's visual appearance as a whole. What we're going to do is take the opposite tack, and we're going to make kind of the smallest area possible. We're not even going to design a whole level, we're going to design a tiny section of a level, and specifically what does it look like and how does that visual appearance equate to function. So for an example, the picture on the wall is very, very helpful. If Sonic didn't exist and we were proposing it as a game, and we were trying to describe to somebody what the game looked like when your feet are kind of on the ground and the player is actually looking at it as it equates to function, if we wanted to describe the Green Hill Zone specifically, this image would sum it up pretty well. We've got a hazard, and then we've got a huge gap. We have an object that provides utility, and that we have a spring. We have platforms that provide the opportunity for platforming and traversal, and then we also have the trees that we can do loot drops in. And then there are some aesthetic elements, which are the flowers and the totem pole, which are an integral part of the level, but functionally speaking aren't really relevant. But it's a good kind of example of what the level would look like in sort of a broader scale. And whichever level you choose from your own ideas, I'm going to leave that up to you guys. The section of the level that you choose should be indicative of that level as a whole and how environments work in your game. In that level rather. But ideally they should be indicative of the game as a whole, as much as possible. So if you have kind of a level in your game that's a one-off, and it's fundamentally different from everything else, maybe don't pick that one. Pick something that's representational of the larger sort of majority of it. So what I'm going to talk about now is some criteria that I want you to consider when you're planning the functionality of your levels. So I'm not a level designer, this isn't a level design class. Our focus when we make these images is really going to be on what the levels look like, but specifically how we're communicating concepts of function to the player. So what shapes, potentially what colors, maybe what textures we use to say to the player, these are the materials that we put in front of you in the environment, and this is how you can use them. So when we think about real life in comparison to the context of a game, we're surrounded by infinite possibility at all times. So even all of us sitting in this room or standing in this room right now, we're surrounded by possibilities. We could jump on the table. We could turn on and use any or all of the computers in the room. We could turn on a projector. We could swing from one of the pipes from the ceiling, although I really wouldn't recommend it. We could move the furniture. We can open and close the door. We can go in and out of the door. Our only limitations in real life are the limitations of physics. Obviously, we're all bound by gravity and all of the other rules that are kind of associated with how physics work, but then also by our own physicality. Are we old? Are we young? Are we physically fit? Are we physically able? And also we're constrained by societal norms as well. If one of you jumps up on top of the table and starts doing a dance, I might call security because I don't know what you're going to do next. Similarly, if you're outside in the real world, we also have this sense of infinite possibility, but we're constrained by the same things. We're constrained by physics, our own physicality, and by societal norms. So as an example, this is the souk in Marrakesh. As an area, it presents an enormous amount of possibility. You could go inside the different stalls, you could interact with the different goods and things that are on display, or you could interact with or push through the crowd, and so on and so forth, constrained by all of the things that I just mentioned. Conversely, games, those possible actions, those things that you could go and do in the environment are referred to as affordances. So things in your environment, whether they're objects, people, or part of the terrain, afford you the opportunity for some kind of action or interaction, hence the word affordances. So affordances in games are limited by the game itself, and it doesn't take a genius to figure out what that means. Games are finite. By definition, they have kind of a beginning and an end, even if it's an open world game that touts itself as having a massive amount of choice for the player. That choice can never really truly be infinite, because you're limited by what the designers and the game creators have made. There's only so many assets in the game, there's only so many mechanics. Logically then, there's only so much that you can do. So, as a kind of equivalent example, this is a souk in one of the cities in Assassin's Creed 1, the original game. And in terms of affording the player different opportunities and creating affordances, it's really well designed, especially for its time. There's a lot of stuff that you can do here. You can interact with the different characters in different ways. You can climb on some of those pieces of wood and kind of jump around. But you're still limited by what the game provides you in terms of affordances. So that sounds like it might be problematic, but really it isn't. When you pick up a controller or you sit down in front of your PC or whichever kind of computer that you're interacting with, when you sit down to consume a game, you come to it with a certain level of expectation of the fact that it is a game and inherently it's going to have its limits. And unless you're a very small child and you don't really understand kind of what the difference is between a game and the real world, if you're very, very small, you might sit down to play a game and wonder why you can't do this infinite number of things that you want to do. But as soon as you're a little bit older and you understand what a game is and basically how it works, you come to most games with that understanding and acceptance that the game is going to have standard conventions, things that you can do and things that you can't do. And it's not necessarily a problem. However, it is an issue if the placement of things in the environment for your game is not very carefully considered. So, for example, ladders are a utilitarian object that have a very, very strong connection and association in our mind with the things that they can do. So, let's say, for example, you arbitrarily place a ladder in your environment. If your game is set in a hardware store, a Home Depot or a Rona, where there are going to be lots of ladders just kind of lying around, if you then can't use them, that's a trigger to the player that something is disconnected, that something doesn't fit, and they're going to lose faith and sort of trust in the fictional world that you're creating for them. So if you're going to include a ladder, a door, a set of stairs, some other kind of utilitarian object that is designed for conveying people from one place to another, then you have to place it judiciously, and you have to let the player use it, or if they can't use it, you need a specific reason why. So, for example, the night before last I was playing The Last of Us just to kind of refresh my memory of that game so that I could talk about it in reference to what I'm talking about now. And there are lots of areas where you're inside buildings and you're passing doors, and the designers need to include doors, otherwise the building isn't going to feel convincing, because we all know that most buildings have lots of doors inside them. But then they have this weird kind of like US military device on the door to seal the door so that you can't go through it. And it feels very, very small and it feels very flimsy. And given how physically strong Joel is as a character, and the fact that he usually has a gun and ammunition on him at all times, it feels like you should be able to break that device and get through that door. So, even though The Last of Us is an absolute masterpiece, it's an incredible game, there's some dissonance there where I, as a player, or as a person I should say, I have an understanding of how that door should work, and I feel like it should be accessible, but it isn't. And so even though the game is very immersive, it does tend to take me out of the experience momentarily. So objects that we closely associate with utility create a strong expectation in the player. We see something, we understand how it works, and we expect to be able to use it. So given what I said earlier in the semester about form following function, when you place things in your environment, even if they aren't a specific object like a ladder or a piece of rope, even if it's something that looks like potentially you could use it to convey yourself from one area to the other, and then the player can't use it, that's problematic. It can break the player's immersion in the game. So, environmental language, and that's what we're going to talk about kind of going forward, is visual language, as we've talked about so far this semester, as it equates directly to your environment and the design of the environment. So the environmental language is kind of the consistency of imagery that you supply to the player of the world around them and what they can do with it, what parts they can use, what parts they can't use, which parts are dangerous and which parts aren't, and so on and so forth. So, going back to the idea of affordances, they fall into 4 major categories. We have explicit affordances, which are things that occur in the game to direct a player's attention to something in the environment that they can use. So to cite The Last of Us again as an example, guns and ammunition are fairly scarce as a resource in that game, but they're also incredibly important. I imagine this is a result of playtesting, given how immersive the game sets out to be, but if there's a gun or bullets in the room that you can collect, the game calls out to your attention to go and get them. That magazine or that gun will actually kind of glow or flash, and it'll usually have a little bit of user interface kind of pointing to it, telling you that it's there. That's not immersive, it's not natural, but given the importance of guns and ammo in that game, it makes sense that the player might need a little bit of extra help to find this resource which is so vital. Defined affordances are attributes that the designers give to the environment which don't really kind of make sense within the context of the real world, and they do feel somewhat arbitrary. And so the example that I cited was, for anyone who's played Mirror's Edge, you know that anything that you can grapple on or kind of interact with, you can shimmy along, anything that's going to help you move through the environment is red, and they don't use red anywhere else in the environment. So red as a color is directly linked to utility. Now obviously if we go out into the campus and we try and do some parkour, and I hasten to add, I don't encourage anyone to do that because you're probably going to hurt yourself, but if you do it, there isn't going to be that same kind of convenience of color. Not everything that you can use for parkour is going to be the same color. It's clearly a contrivance, but it's a very important one within the context of that game, given that for anyone who's not played that game, you have to make decisions about where you're going to jump and run to at speed, under pressure. And so using red as an indicator of utility, it's very useful to the player, because as you're running along a building and you need to jump off the edge and then swing on something or grab onto something, you need it to be obvious and demonstrative what that thing is. And so the designers have used color to make that possible for the player. Cultural affordances are probably the most natural, in that when we see a ladder and when we see stairs, we understand what they mean because they exist in the real world, and we already have an innate understanding of how that works. So ladders, fire, and ropes. I mentioned fire as an example. We don't typically think of it as being part of the environment. Generally speaking, we think of physical matter being part of the environment, or natural matter, whether it's trees, furniture, or buildings. Fire as an element feels like it's kind of separate. I guess water would do as well. But it is an integral part of the environment, and it has a lot of utility to it. At the very sort of most basic, fire can deal damage to a player in a game if they move through it or across it. But you can also use it as a kind of utilitarian object, obviously to burn things or use it as a weapon and so on and so forth. Finally, we've got inferred affordances, which are utilitarian objects which are communicated to the player, and the player comes to understand as having a particular function within the context of that game. So a good example of that would be in the earlier Prince of Persia games from kind of the PS2, Xbox era. So Sands of Time, Warrior Within, and Two Thrones, or Twin Thrones, I forget what it's called. In those games, when you're moving around the environment, if you see a vertical piece of cloth kind of hanging from floor to ceiling, you can jump onto it, stick your sword into it, and slide down from top to bottom and use it as a traversal mechanic. Now, any of us, if we see a huge vertical tapestry hanging in space, we're probably not going to jump onto it and try and slide down it. I would strongly recommend not doing that, because you have no idea what the tensile strength of the fabric is or how it's attached to the wall, so you might fall and hurt yourself. But within the context of Prince of Persia, the game teaches you very quickly what that piece of fabric does, and then going forward, anytime you see that piece of fabric in the room, even if it's not immediately accessible, you know that it has this utilitarian function, and that at some point you can go to it and use it to move from one point to another. So, cultural and inferred affordances, so things that we recognize intuitively because they really exist, and things that the game teaches us have a utility, tend to intrude the least on player immersion. So, the example that I cited before, The Last of Us does use a lot of user interface, and in kind of in a not very subtle way. So for example, when you hold the right trigger and you use Joel's hearing mechanic, it's basically like bat vision in Arkham Asylum. You can see through walls and see silhouettes of characters that otherwise you wouldn't be able to see. Now, is that realistic? No, but within the context of the game, you come to accept it fairly quickly. And the same thing is true of explicit affordances. It's not that you can't use them, but if you're using them all the time, it makes the game feel more and more like a game and less like reality. So as a designer, you have to strike a balance between the need to create a realistic or immersive experience, and then also you need to provide the player with things that they can actually use and they can actually do. So in some cases, you do have to call out to the player and say, okay, here is a thing that you can interact with, and you can do X with it, and you need to pay attention to it now. So, with regard to what you guys are going to do, and the section, the tiny swatch of a level that you're going to make, you need some idea of where to begin in terms of figuring out what affordances you're going to put in your environment and what it is that they do. So, you could list, or mind map, because I know how much you all love mind maps after I've made you do one, list your mechanics as they equate to environment and to traversal. So here I've got a list which is the traversal mechanics from Prince of Persia. I might have missed one or two, I'm not sure. It's not an exhaustive list. But generally speaking, this is where you would begin. So you could take your list of movement mechanics directly from your mind map that you have already. And basically for each of these criteria, you're going to think of examples of different things that would necessitate the player using these mechanics. So move is kind of a given, whether it's run or walk or a combination of both. If you put flat surfaces in front of the player or close to flat surfaces, and the player knows that they begin at one point and they have an objective at another point, they're going to use the move mechanic just intuitively because they want to experience and want to move through the game. If you're going to ask them to climb, jump, roll, climb, or shimmy, or anything else that you're going to ask them to do, you may need to give them a context which is much more specific, whether that's a gap in the floor like Sonic the Hedgehog, or it's a set of spikes that you have to jump over, if it's some kind of trap that they have to roll underneath. This is an opportunity for you guys to think about what you're going to populate the environment with to make sure that your player needs to use all of these different mechanics that you're providing them with. So for each of those mechanics and for each of those affordances that you are going to place in the environment, you need to define a set of rules and try to keep them to extremes. And then that way we can try to avoid confusing the player. So thinking about flat surfaces on which you can walk or run is a perfect example of where you need some kind of metric where you're going to establish what angles a player can walk on and then what they can't. So obviously when you've got a 90-degree flat floor, any player is going to see that and know that that's something that they can walk on. Conversely, when you have a perpendicular surface, so like a wall or a fence or something like that, because it is vertical, the player is going to know that they can't walk on that unless you have some kind of specific mechanic which allows them to walk up the wall, and you're going to have to teach the player that they can do that, because their initial intuitive reaction is going to be, I can walk on the floor, but I can't walk on the wall, because that's true for real life. So in the case of designing floors and the angle on which they appear, you could pick an arbitrary number and say floors of anything of 35 degrees or less, the player is going to be able to walk or run on that, and 45 degrees and above, they can't run or walk on that surface. So if that's the case, if those are your kind of like two parameters, one is kind of like the limitation for walking, and then one of them is a limitation which begins to define the walls for your game. Picking any kind of number in between those two is problematic because it could be confusing to the player, and I'm going to show you exactly what I mean. So here we've got a 90-degree, we've got a flat surface which is floor. Anyone can look at that and understand that that's something that they can move around and they can walk on. And then what I've got next is a 35-degree angle. Now I don't know if I can walk up a 35-degree angle, but looking at that image there, I'm going to guess and say, yeah, I probably can. There's other factors that would go into that. How slippery is the surface? How grippy are my shoes? Are there things that I can hold on to, and so on and so forth? So in the top row, what I've got is 90 degrees, 35 degrees, and then 45 degrees. And then the final shape is, in green is 35 degrees, and red is 45 degrees to show you the difference between the two. So if 35 degrees and below means yes, you're good to go, and 45 degrees and above means no, you can't walk on that, the difference visually between the two is really, really minimal. So if you did place anything in between those 2 points, it's going to be really, really confusing to the player, and they might reach a ramp or a slope that they think they can go up, but they actually can't because it's so close to 45 degrees. I would advocate taking it kind of one step further and making the difference between the two much greater. So in the bottom row, we have a flat surface again. Obviously, we know we can walk on that. We can walk on a flat surface up to 35 degrees. And then any surface that you can't walk on, I would make an angle of 55 degrees or greater. And when you look at the image at the very end of the green and the red overlaid on one another, you can see that the difference, the variance between those two angles is much greater, and it's going to be much, much clearer to the player what is accessible and what is inaccessible. So whether you're determining angles on which somebody can walk, or you're determining heights of things that the player can climb over, or gaps that they can jump, let's say, and I'm just going to pick an arbitrary number, your playable character can jump a gap of 1 meter, but they can't jump a gap of 1 meter, 1 centimeter. Well, you don't want to make a gap in your game 1 meter, 5 centimeters. It's so close to the space that they can jump over that it's going to be confusing, and they're probably going to attempt it, fail, and then wonder why the heck this is happening. So, arbitrarily speaking, if your maximum distance of jumping is 1 meter, to make a jump that the player cannot make and to make it really, really clear, I would go double and make that gap 2 meters, and then the difference between the two is very, very obvious to the player, and you're not going to get that confusion whereby the player is going to cost themselves kind of opportunities or lives or points or whatever it is by trying to perform a task that they just can't perform, even though it looks like they should be able to. In terms of the arrangement of things that you put in your environment, Sonic maybe isn't the best example because it's a very kind of, visually it's a very simple game. It's not very cluttered, there's not that much in it. So you can clearly see the trees and the platforms and the gap all kind of superimposed against the sky. I think in the actual game there's kind of water and mountains and stuff off in the background, but they're so small and they're so far away, they just function as this kind of background veneer that you don't really pay a lot of attention to. Given the visual complexity of contemporary games, it is something that you need to think about, is how you arrange these affordances in your environment and making sure that the player can see them. Sometimes you're going to want something to be partially obscured because you want the player to actually have to actively look for it. So let's say the player needs to find a door, you hide it behind like a bush or something like that, or like a piece of tattered fabric, so that there is some opportunity for the player to see it, but it's not completely visible, but neither is it completely occluded either, where it's just invisible to the player. Especially if your game kind of leverages high pressure situations where you're asking the player to respond to things in real time, like a first person shooter or Mirror's Edge is another good example. The player needs to be able to access that information visually fairly quickly, and so if you clutter your play space with lots of different stuff, potentially you're going to make it more difficult for the player to use. So for example, contextually, I have no idea why this giant piece of rock is in the middle of this room. I find all of the art in Gears of War really confusing because visually speaking, I don't understand what it is I'm supposed to be looking at. It's a really fun game, mechanically it's great, but like God knows what this building is that they're standing in, I just don't get it. But having said that, I can clearly see the utility of this stone block, and it's clearly accessible to the player, and it's clearly visible to the player, so they can see it and then use it and interact with it and use it to facilitate the cover mechanic in the game. But if it was surrounded by other pillars and other pieces of rock that made it difficult for the player to see, then potentially it's difficult for the player to use. I talked a bit at the beginning of the semester about silhouette, so the external shape of people, animals, or objects, or buildings in the world around us, and how that is the visual information of any object that our eye reads first. So when you guys are designing the objects and things that you're going to put in your environment, think about what the silhouette is. Think about that external shape and how quickly you can convey information about what this thing does to the player. So a ladder is a good example. It has a very distinctive silhouette that we can all see, recognize, and understand. Something like a stone block in Gears of War, for example, it's less clearly defined in terms of silhouette. It's kind of amorphous. but provided not too much else in the environment are basically sort of rectangles lying on the floor, the player is going to come to recognize those horizontal rectangles as places of safety and places of utility. Also try and think about negative space, so contrasting values or colors or textures against one another to try and make the shapes legible. And ultimately what this all adds up to is that concept of shape language that we talked about with regard to your world map. So with your world map, we were thinking about both function and emotional content from the shapes. We're doing the same thing here. We're thinking about emotional content kind of all the time. What does the game look like? But in terms of designing the visual language of our levels, we really want to focus right now on functional language, explaining to the player intuitively what the things in our environment do. So with regard to shape language in environments, it really boils down to some very, very simple shapes and simple metrics. This isn't an exhaustive list, and this isn't to say that you can't use spherical shapes or rounded shapes as a hazard in your environments. You could, because you could draw the player's attention to the fact that they're hazardous through other means, whether that's through color, texture, shaders, user interface, sound, so on and so forth. Animation is another big one. But generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, when you're beginning thinking about any visual design for a level where you're trying to communicate utility to the player, generally speaking, rounded shapes are benign, they're non-threatening, they're not dangerous, but they're not especially useful. Geometric shapes that have right angles and horizontal and vertical faces and edges, they tend to scream utility, and they will call out to the player and say, you can do something with me. And then finally, the most obvious is that when you make something spiky and it's covered in acute angles and points, generally speaking, visually, we're going to read that as being dangerous, and we're going to try and stay away from it. So here, I'm going to show you these videos in YouTube rather than in the PowerPoint, because they're a little bit easier to use. So for anyone who doesn't recognize this, this is the original Prince of Persia game from 1989, I think. I think I've shown it to you already this semester. In terms of affordances and in terms of like visual communication, this game is limited by when it was made. So only so much technology was available to the designers, and so one of the reasons why it looks the way it does is because the tools that were available to the people making the game were not as sophisticated as what we have now, obviously. But having said that, in terms of communicating function to the player, it's decidedly unambiguous. It's very clear which edges you can grapple with, which edges you can't grapple with, what falls are going to be fatal, which distances the player can jump across, which distances they can't jump across, and so on and so forth. So if we kind of fast forward a few years, a kind of spiritual successor to Prince of Persia was Flashback, which was released for the Sega Genesis and also the Commodore Amiga, which is what I played it on. And it's very, very similar aesthetically. They've used rotoscoping again for the player animations, which is why it looks so smooth and so natural. And in terms of level design and function, it's very similar. You can run and jump, you can grab onto and grapple with ledges and lift yourself up. I guess the player just died. But in terms of visual design, it's much harder to read than the level design in Prince of Persia. They've introduced a lot more visual complexity because now we've got this jungle and vines and all sorts of different, more complex components in the environment. But the way that they've been implemented is not very effective. So it's difficult, much more difficult for the player to understand which parts of the environment they can interact with, which ones they can't, which falls are going to be fatal, and so on and so forth. So it's maybe an example of designers not being judicious enough about the information that they supply to the player, showing the player explicitly what is functional and what isn't. So obviously this is a much newer version of Prince of Persia, but this is still a really old game. It still has many of the same hallmarks where even though the environment is much more visually complex, there's much more stuff here to do, it looks much more beautiful, there's way more textures. Despite all of that increased visual complexity, it's still very apparent to the player, generally speaking in these games, what they can and can't do as it equates to the environment. And so we can clearly see these pillars. These pillars are a good example of an inferred affordance, where we might be able to slide down a pillar like that, but being able to jump from one pillar to the other, I know I physically can't do that. I imagine none of you can either. But within the context of the game establishes very quickly that that's something that the player can do. It's very easy to see those pillars, it's easy to understand and see what their function is, and then by putting them next to one another in the environment, the designers chain together this possibility of gameplay where the player can see, well, I can run across the wall and now jump onto this pillar, shimmy around, jump onto the next pillar, and so on and so forth. So in terms of visual clarity, it's still very, very well executed, even though there's a greater degree of complexity. I'm sure we've all played at least one Uncharted game. If you haven't, I highly recommend them. They are really, really good. So this is Uncharted 4. Uncharted uses defined affordances to tell the player which parts of the environment they can interact with and which parts they can't. Given what Nathan Drake does and who he is as a character, he spends a lot of time clambering around on brick faces and rock faces and doing stuff like this, like swinging on logs and whatnot, even though the physics of it might not really make sense. But you'll notice on these platforms that he's interacting with right now, they have this white kind of texture on the top. Now, I don't know if that's meant to be snow, or if it's meant to be bird poo, or mold, or moss, or whatever. It really doesn't matter, but this is a defined indication to the player that this is something that they can interact with, and I'm going to show you a really good example of it right here. What we've got when he's climbing up this column is we have lots of ledges and fissures and different pieces that really, if the game was reflective of reality, you should be able to use any one of these ledges or fissures to kind of shimmy along. But obviously that's cost prohibitive when you're making a game, especially one as linear as Uncharted, and in this case Uncharted 4. Uncharted happens in a corridor, inside a corridor if you like. The game's wholly linear. And so here, even though you should be able to use any of these ledges, you can only use one. And so the designers are directly signaling to you, the player, that this is the affordance that you can use. And these similar instances are simply aesthetic. They're not functional. They are all kind of the same thing relative to the context of the game and the environment. But in terms of player interaction and player utility, only one of them is useful. So we've got a repetition of it here as well. If you backtrack and go back to that platform, that you can grapple with that one edge, and you know that because it has that white kind of texture on it. So The Last of Us has similar mechanics to Uncharted, maybe a little bit more kind of bound and constrained by the rules of conventional physics as we sort of understand them. Nathan Drake is a bit more of a superhero than Joel, the principal character in The Last of Us, but it's still very, very similar ideas in terms of traversal, climbing, climbing over obstacles, jumping, grabbing hold of ledges and lifting yourself up. So as much as The Last of Us is very immersive, and in many ways the way that they treat this idea of a post-apocalyptic pandemic, it's intensely realistic and sort of uncompromising in many ways. When you look around this environment, it's hard for me, as I'm sort of looking at it objectively, it's hard for me to understand why the environment looks the way that it does, given what's happened in this fictional world. So for anyone who's not played the game, basically a fungal kind of virus infects the population of the world, and it turns people into these horrible kind of zombie-like creatures. But what they never really account for explicitly in the game, as far as I can remember, is why the shape of the world is what it is. Now, there could have been an earthquake, some kind of military intervention here that maybe accounts for why there's so much verticality in the environment. But really, I think it's one of those contrivances that you as a player just kind of accept and you just kind of get on with. Because you need that verticality in the environment to facilitate the type of gameplay that The Last of Us is all about. And you spend a lot of time doing this, which is kind of moving from one hole in the ground to the next, climbing up through a shattered building or through a train car or whatever it is, and moving from point to point to point. So if you think about it objectively, it isn't really believable, but once you're playing the game within the context of the game, these affordances and these objects in the environment with which you can interact, you come to accept them as being convincing and believable. Now, I've got one more video I want to show you, which is footage from Trine 2. I'm just showing you this because it's a good example of a 2.5D game. where the gameplay is constrained to the horizontal axis, but we have this amazing visual, very beautiful visual depth to the game. It's not really directly interactive with the player, although enemy sprites do spawn in the background and foreground and kind of jump into the playable area. But it's a good example of the fact that the same metrics and the same rules apply regardless of whether your game is 3D or whether it's 2D or 2.5D. You still have the same considerations when it comes to metrics of size and of scale, platforms that you can or can't climb onto, gaps that you can or can't jump over. And this game is a good example because it has a whole bunch of kind of puzzle mechanics where you use crates and other objects to interact with different platforms. The same considerations are still there. We can see, well, let me just backtrack a little bit there. This is kind of, it's sort of like level design 101, but we can see some clear examples of what I was talking about before in terms of shape language. Right here in this scene, we have hazards that are represented by spikes, and in this case they're wooden stakes. So we know that those walls are hazardous, we shouldn't go up there. And we have utility in that we have flat shapes that we know that we can interact with. So in this case it's the ground and then a ledge and then also the crate. And so our background items, even though they're not spherical, they are still softer and more natural in that we have kind of vines and plants and stuff constituting our environment, and we know that they're not interactive but they're also not dangerous. So again, those shapes, those three different types of shapes, they're not totally exclusive of any other type of shape, and you can use those different shapes to communicate different ideas than generally what they're used for, but you have to do it judiciously. So in the case of Uncharted, obviously there's a lot of geometry in that environment as you're moving around inside a ruined city, but you have to be, the designers have to be very careful about how they communicate the utility of those different shapes to the player so that the player has some idea of where they can go and where they can't go. So I'm going to talk some more about this next week, and we're going to start working on our environment design specifically next week after we've finished with our gameplay storyboards. But this assignment kind of bridges the work week and sprint week. So I'm going to ask you to kind of like bury this stuff in your subconscious a little bit and then try and recall it a few weeks from now. I will revisit sort of the concept of affordances and metrics when I show you some examples of how I would go about visually designing a level. But for now, this is a good place to begin, is kind of with those building blocks of how you establish function for the player, how you equip them with things in the environment that facilitate or create the requirement of them using their mechanics. And then also, at the most basic level, how you begin to develop metrics to decide how big or small these things are going to be relative to one another. Any questions? All right, awesome.